Okay, so I did my literature review on the effect of altitude on depression and suicide. So to start, suicide is a leading cause of death in the United States. It's the 10th leading cause across everyone, and it's actually the second leading cause for adults age 18 to 34. And the suicide belt is a region of the country that contains 8 of the 10 states with the highest suicide rates. Utah is included in that. It actually has the highest suicide rate in the nation. It's almost 2 times the national average. All of these states have relative high elevations, which has led scientists to investigate altitude as a potential risk factor for depression and suicide. So if you look at the graphic on the right, it's got them broken up by all suicide, firearm suicide, and non-firearm suicide. And you can see in all three that area that is the Intermountain West, or the suicide belt, which includes Colorado, and Utah, and Wyoming, and Idaho, and so on, is darker red. There's a lot higher rates of suicide there. So scientists, seeing that obvious correlation between those states and their higher rates of suicide, they wanted to see if altitude or atmospheric pressure of oxygen at elevation is in fact a risk factor. So in 2018, a study was done which actually involved some students from BYU's College of Life Sciences, and they analyzed the suicide rates from counties across the contiguous 48 states from 1999 to 2010. They made this a block study by organizing the data into firearm suicides and non-firearm suicides, meaning using guns or not. And one of the cool things about the study is they actually were able to use population-based altitude averages for each county, which allows them to account only for area where people actually live, as opposed to including mountain ranges or land masses where no one actually lives. And the example for us here in Utah County have been including the Wasatch Mountains, where no one actually lives. Everyone's in the valley. So the study concluded that atmospheric pressure was globally related to suicide rates for all firearm and non-firearm suicides alike. You can see at the bottom it says that an increase in atmospheric pressure by 100 HPA, which is just a measure of, it's a unit of measure for pressure, was associated with a decrease in suicide rate by 4 people per 100,000, and that was leaving all the other factors the same. So there have been a lot of studies that have identified a correlation between altitude and depression and suicide, but they're unable to rule out the possibility that it could be due to other confounding factors like socioeconomic status or other cultural things. So Brent Kios and his colleagues sought to design a study that would bridge that knowledge gap and identify if they could prove that there would be more depressive episodes when you moved to higher altitude. So their study, they used the intern method, and what they did was follow medical students to their residencies, measure them both at baseline, which was at the end of medical school, and after they're in their residency at higher altitude. And they looked at these psychiatric indicators and found that there were in fact more depressive episodes and suicidal thoughts when they moved to higher elevation. Now, couple limitations just from this study is one, that there was only about 5% of medical school graduates that actually went to a residency higher than 4,000 feet. And every single one of those 5% was in either Salt Lake City or Denver. So there's a relative lack of area in the United States where you could go to a medical residency that would be higher than 4,000 feet. So there could still be some other factors in those two areas that could lead to higher depression episodes. In 2018, a scientist named Chandy Seth conducted a study on rats to test altitude as a risk factor. And one of the best ways to see if there is a real correlation is to be able to do a study on animals, because we can impose more specific conditions on them. So she was able to impose high altitude conditions for the rats by limiting the amount of oxygen they had in each of their boxes. They kept them for a week and observe them both at the oxygen levels experienced in Salt Lake City and those at sea level. One of the cool things about this is they're able to observe on an individual level, as opposed to, with humans, we have to do a population level epidemiological study, which is more difficult than just simply looking on one individual level from one condition to the other. And it was found that rats, but especially female rats, displayed more depressive and anxiety-like behaviors than male rats in these conditions. This has some pretty important clinical implications. As we know, women have higher levels of depressive and anxiety disorders already, and it suggests that people, and women especially, are likely more prone to developing mood disorders in that type of elevation or chronic hypoxic condition. There are a couple possible mechanisms or physiological pathways that show links to hypoxia and the increased levels of depression and suicide. I won't go too deep into them because they get a little more technical and very physiological, but basically serotonin is a hormone that is closely related to mood. And there's been autopsies done on suicide victims, and they found that there's a reduction in serotonin levels and their receptors in the blood and brain tissue of suicide victims. So it's been posed that hypoxia impairs an actual enzyme involved in the serotonin production pathway, which is linked to depression. And it's also important because this suggests that the most prescribed antidepressants may not actually be effective when the brain has low serotonin levels, because they have to do with serotonin reuptake in our brain. The other pathway is the creatine kinase pathway. And this was another study done by Brent Kios, and it basically found that when a reduced brain ratio of PCR to inorganic phosphate is associated with depression. So the more inorganic phosphate that is floating around relative to phosphocreatine, which is what we use for energy, is associated with depression. And we know that hypoxia promotes changes in energy metabolism, and it leads to reduction in reserve energy in both the brain and our muscle tissue. There are some critics of this theory. They argue that it's simply too simple of an explanation, that it ignores other social and cultural factors of the Intermountain West. Some of those include relative social isolation, there's more access to firearms here, and a relative lack of behavioral health services compared to more densely populated areas. It's also been said that the cultural influences of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah can also have a big impact, especially on LGBTQ youth. One of the other challenges with a study like this is it's nearly impossible to assign treatments to people in order to study it. We can't assign someone to live at 6,000 or 7,000 feet and monitor the depression levels while controlling for all other potential confounding factors. However, in conclusion, I think that this is still very important. There's a very strong correlation between altitude and depression suicide rates. There are, of course, always going to be complicated social and cultural issues that play a factor in suicide. But be it a large or small factor, a biological factor like hypoxia is modifiable. So if we know that it is a factor, we can find the right treatment that will help prescribe something to people dealing with depression and suicidal thoughts. We know that high altitude residence does cause chronic hypoxic conditions, and we've seen by studies that it does result in changes in brain chemistry. So knowing this, healthcare providers can prescribe interventions such as supplemental oxygen at night, or tryptophan, or serotonin supplements that can help alleviate depression symptoms and help the antidepressants if they aren't doing enough for someone.